The U.S. is, by definition, waging a proxy war against Russia, using Ukrainians as their instrument, with the goal of not ending the war, but prolonging it. That's what the United States is doing. So obvious is this fact about U.S. objectives that even the New York Times last Sunday explicitly reported that the Biden administration seeks to help Ukraine lock Russia in a quagmire. Surveying all this evidence, as well as discussions with his own U.S. and British sources, Niall Ferguson, writing in Bloomberg, proclaimed, "I conclude that the United States intends to keep this war going." The UK officials similarly told him that the UK's number one option is for the conflict to be extended and thereby bleed Putin. Hovering above all these grave dangers is the question of why. What interest does the U.S. have in Ukraine? What are sufficiently vital or substantial to justify trifling with the risks of a frickin' nuclear war? Why did the U.S. not do more to try to diplomatically avert this horrific war, instead seemingly opting for the opposite, namely discouraging Ukrainian President Zelensky from pursuing such peace talks on the alleged grounds of futility and rewarding Russian aggression, and not even exploring whether a vow of non-NATO membership for Ukraine would suffice? Why did the U.S. not try more to de-escalate this situation? What do you say?
Well, I think at the end of the day, it is the strategy of the United States to isolate Russia. And this war and provoking it and doing everything they can to kind of force this situation has been what has led to their ability to do so.
And what do you make of Zelensky? So a lot of people have said that what the United States and NATO is doing is they're sacrificing the people of Ukraine to get slaughtered. And why would Zelensky go along with that? The president of Ukraine. Why would he go along with that? Because the U.S. and NATO, they don't really give a shit about Ukrainian people. They care about, energy transfers and economic interests and things like that. They don't really care about people at all. So why would Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, go along with the United States?
Well, on the first point that you made there, I just have to agree with you. There's all this moralizing about Ukraine right now. The hearts of all the world, we're supposed to care about the people of Ukraine. If you care about the people of Ukraine, you wouldn't be plotting to turn their homeland into a long-term battlefield against Russia, right? If you care about the people of Ukraine, you would be trying to end this conflict as quickly as possible, which is not what Joe Biden is doing as he pours gasoline on it with threats to topple the Russian president, etc. But if you get down to it, Zelensky was elected as a peace candidate. He was elected because most Ukrainians want to de-escalate this. And he was elected as a repudiation of the more extreme right-wing anti-Russian forces in the country. But he wasn't able to fulfill the platform he got elected on, because at the end of the day, he doesn't really have the power. There are these extremist groups that the U.S. media denies, the Azov Battalion, the Right Sector, etc. And there's just a lot of straight up management of Ukraine by the NATO countries, by foreign policy NGOs that have set up in Kiev. He doesn't have the power. He's a puppet. People say that this is a war against an independent country. Ukraine's independence ended in 2014 when the USA toppled the elected government. And since then, basically, Ukraine has just been a NATO military base pointed at Russia and doing everything it can to provoke some kind of Russian response to its actions. And now that response is happening, and they're acting like this came from nowhere.
What interest does the United States have in Ukraine that are sufficiently vital or substantial to justifying trifling with the risks of this magnitude?
Well, there's no interest for us. I mean, average Americans aren't gaining from this in any conceivable way. But there are big oil companies and big natural gas companies who see Russia as a competitor, right? When Russia was poor and starving in the 90s and falling apart, Bill Clinton loved Boris Yeltsin. Everything was great. But when Putin got in and he rebuilt their economy, restructuring it around government-controlled oil and gas, at that point, Russia was selling oil on the international markets, selling natural gas on the international markets in competition with ExxonMobil and BP and Shell and Chevron. And ever since then, there's been tension. They see Russia as a competitor on the international stage. They don't like that. They want the world to remain centered around Wall Street and London. They want those oil profits. They want those natural gas profits. And they don't like the fact that Russia is in on the business.
And so when Glenn Greenwald asked the question, how does growing U.S. involvement in the war benefit the people of the United States, particularly as they were already before this war weighed down by the dual burdens of pandemic-based economic deprivations and rapidly escalating inflation, you would say it doesn't benefit us at all.
No, this is like Walmart. You know, when Walmart comes to a town, it drops its prices. It puts all the local stores out of business. The people who work at all the local stores lose their jobs. They wipe out their competitors. And then once their competition is wiped out, then the prices go back up, right? And this is how monopolism works. This is monopolistic capitalism. They don't like that Russia is a competitor. They don't like that China has risen up from poverty. They don't want competition. That's really all this gets down to. Russia is now a competitor, just like China is a competitor, just like other countries around the world are competitors, and they don't want that competition. They want to dominate the world market, and they want to drive down living standards in order to do so. And this pandemic has presented them with a great opportunity. I mean, this is the monopolistic forces based in the Western countries kind of dictating policy and trying to drive the world into greater poverty in order to secure their profits.
I think, as Glenn Greenwald says, it's too late to ask those questions. It might be too late to have those questions meaningfully examined, like why are we there? What are our interests? What are we willing to our involvement levels? Do you think we'll ever have that kind of discussion in the United States?
Well, mainstream media isn't going to have those conversations.
Right.
And everything we've seen from mainstream media lately has been nothing but the most blatant, blind support for U.S. foreign policy. I mean, this is, I mean, it's a lot like when the USA went into Iraq, but even then there was at least some criticism you heard. But this is really, really blatant. But at the same time, beneath the surface, there are a lot of Americans that are more upset about the rising price of gas, more upset about the rising price of food, wondering why the roads are crumbling, wondering why the power grid in Texas collapsed last winter during an exceptionally cold winter. And at that point, there's a lot of Americans saying, why aren't we worried about the problems in our own backyard and what's going on here in the United States than what's going on the other side of the world? As much as they want to pluck our heartstrings. Look, Jimmy, when it gets down to it, most people are good, okay? If you hear about someone being harmed on the other side of the planet, you hear about a child starving or a family fleeing as refugees, you want to help them. And that's good. Most people care about other people. Most people have empathy and kindness. But the sad thing is that the most evil people, I mean, these war hawks, Samantha Power and other forces, Victoria Nuland, have figured out how to use media to manipulate these really good, compassionate, altruistic sentiments on the part of people to build a case for war. And what always happens? Are the Libyans any better off, right? You know, they cared so much about those Libyans. They had to get rid of Gaddafi. Look at Libya now. What about the Iraqis? You know, what about the people of Syria as they've been funding extremists there? The people never benefit from this, but they're very good at getting the emotions going and manipulating our basic human solidarity. It's really, really sinister. These must be very, very cynical people at the end of the day.
So so even France's president, Emmanuel Macron, he warned on Sunday against a verbal escalation over Russia's invasion in Ukraine after Joe Biden branded Vladimir Putin a butcher who cannot remain in power. I would not use that kind of language, he said. If a ceasefire is to be brokered, we must not escalate, neither through words nor actions. And Zelensky said on Sunday that a Russian demand of Ukrainian neutrality, a key issue for Moscow at conflict negotiations, was being closely looked at by Kiev's negotiators. The point of the negotiation is understandable to me, and it is being discussed. It is being carefully studied, said Zelensky. Now, first of all, why is he studying? What is there to study, and why isn't he just going forward with it?
Well, look, I think that at the end of the day, Zelensky is trying to do a balancing act because while he doesn't have the power, there's a lot of these NATO allies that aren't fully where Joe Biden's at. Joe Biden is trying to escalate this. You can interpret this as just an old man and gaffes, but if that's the case, he needs to resign because this is a serious situation. And if you don't know how to clearly articulate policy, you shouldn't be in office. I mean, I think, honestly, that what's going on here is they're hiding behind Joe Biden's sleepy Joe old man reputation, and they're trying to make threats that they can then walk back and not be held accountable for. I think that that's what's going on here. Because if this is just a straight up incompetence, I mean, it's something pretty unbelievable. But at the end of the day, Zelensky, the NATO countries are guiding him, but not all the NATO countries are fully on board with this. Germany was very reluctant. They just built that Nord Stream 2 natural gas pipeline. They were ready to start buying natural gas from Russia, and now we have this crisis, and all of a sudden they can't do it. And France has got questions as well. And I think a lot of the countries specifically on the European mainland are asking themselves, why are we escalating with Russia at this point? What do we benefit from it? And a lot of people have just got to be asking, okay, it's one thing, you don't approve of Russia, whatever, but why should we import natural gas all the way from the United States, all the way from the other side of the planet? When we can get it over the border from Russia. We built this special pipeline to Germany. What is going on here? And they have to ask themselves, is going along with Washington's latest moralistic crusade, is this really in our interests?
Caleb, but let me just ask you to close out this segment. How do you think it's going to end up? I mean, everybody knows how this has to end up, meaning that Ukraine has to go back to being a neutral actor, right? And they have to stop shelling the people in the Donbass, meaning Ukraine government has to stop killing those people. And so how do you think it's going to end up?
Well, my hope is that the government in Kiev will recognize that the people of the eastern regions who wanted to be part of Ukraine, that basically if they're not going to have that, then they have the right to independence, and recognize that, look, if we're not going to treat you with respect, we're going to keep attacking you and not let you be part of Ukrainian society, I guess you can be independent. And if the Donbass regions, Donetsk and Lugansk, if their independence is recognized and Ukraine is going to agree to not join NATO and not keep piling U.S. weapons in there, I think this could end. Unfortunately, it seems like the strategy of the United States is, as you read in the Glenn Greenwald article, they're trying to set up for a long-term conflict. They want this to be the new Afghanistan. They want Russians to be in Ukraine, fighting and dying for year after year after year. But I think Moscow knows this as well, and they're not going to go along with that, and et cetera. So my hope is that that forces in Europe, forces in Kiev that don't want this conflict to continue will say, look, Lugansk, Donetsk, we'll leave them alone. And at that point, this can all be de-escalated. Unfortunately, that is not the goal of the United States. And the scary thing is that the training of these extremist forces, not the Ukrainian military, but these Azov battalion, right fanatics, these folks. I mean, look at some of the photos. I know you can't show them on here of what they're doing in the areas that they take over, where they're torturing people, they're targeting people on the basis of their ethnicity, Roma people, others. I mean, what they're doing is just horrendous. U.S. media is just covering up real atrocities, executing prisoners of war, just executing prisoners of war. We only hear one side of the story. We only hear allegations against Russia, but the documented facts of what these extreme forces that have gotten CIA and U.S. National Guard training over the past few years are doing is really, really horrendous. And I don't know if Zelensky will be able to completely control those forces. And that may be what the forces that want a long-term conflict are depending on. It may be that Zelensky and other forces are ready to end this, but these extremist elements that they have cultivated don't.
You think Zelensky's afraid that Nazis will kill him if he makes a deal?
Oh, sure. I mean, ever since he got elected, they've been having protests against him. They've been having torch-lit marches that look a lot like, Charlottesville, where they're marching and calling for a new Euromaidan. They consider him to be a traitor. They say that he's not really Ukrainian because he's Jewish, etc. Those far-right forces have been threatening him and calling for his ouster from the beginning. And they have a lot of influence in the military, and the United States has been giving them a lot of support.